Welcome to Better Sex, where you get the information and inspiration to create and enjoy your best possible sex life. Join your host, sex therapist Jessa Zimmerman, as she brings you expert guests, helpful tips, knowledge, and strategies to improve your intimate relationships. And now, your host, Jessa Zimmerman.
Hi, it's Jessa. Thanks for being here for yet another episode of the Better Sex Podcast. I love doing this. I have so much fun talking about sex every week and trying to think of really creative, interesting topics or super helpful topics to help you enrich your sex life. So that's what I'm doing with the show. I would love to hear from you. If you want to get in touch, you can always leave a comment through the website, bettersexpodcast.com. You can record questions there. If you want me to answer something on the show, there's a little place you can record a question. And if it seems like it's appropriate for an awful lot of people, I might answer it on the episode. And I also just want to make sure you know that I have started offering monthly free webinars that are question and answer, sort of an Ask Me Anything format. So that is available to everybody that's on my mailing list, basically. So if you are interested in that, you can sign up at the podcast website or at jessazimmerman.com and get on the list, and then you'll be alerted and can participate in the monthly webinars. I would love to have you join me. Today's topic, maybe I say this every week, but this really is one of my very favorite topics. We're going to be talking about sexual fantasies and eroticism. I am interviewing Dr. Justin Lehmiller, who has a new book out called Tell Me What You Want. And it's based on the research he did over a couple of years, interviewed thousands of people, got detailed descriptions of their fantasies, and then put all that data together. So on the show, he's talking about what are those themes? What are the 7? He basically had 7 fantasy themes that account for like 96% of people's fantasies. What our fantasies say about us, and then especially how do couples use this information? How can you share your fantasies, potentially act out your fantasies in a way that can really enrich and enliven your sex life? It's a fascinating conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. Justin, thanks so much for being with me today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jessa.
Yeah, I am excited to talk about this because this is one of my favorite topics with my clients, eroticism and fantasy. So I'm delighted to talk to the expert.
It's a fun topic, and I've been pleased with the amount of interest I've seen based on the book. It seems like a lot of people not just want to talk about their fantasies, but want to learn about them too.
Right. So maybe could you just give a little overview about the research you did, and then maybe we could talk about, what you learned about what are the most common fantasies or what are the themes that you found?
Sure. So I surveyed almost 4,200 Americans from all 50 states about their favorite sexual fantasies, but also hundreds of different people, places, and things that they might have ever fantasized about. So they completed this exhaustive questionnaire, which had 369 questions on it, that asked about all kinds of fantasy content, as well as their personalities, their sexual histories, their demographics. So the goal was for me to look at not just what they're fantasizing about, but how their fantasies are connected to different aspects of the self and who they are.
Over what period of time did you collect those surveys?
So the data were collected between 2014 and 2016. It took almost 2 years to collect all the data.
Yeah.
I wasn't paying people to do the survey, and it was a really long one. So it took a while to get a large sample.
Yeah. Okay. So what did you find? What are the takeaways in terms of like the themes or the most common fantasies? Let's start there.
Okay. So when I analyzed people's favorite fantasies of all time, I found that there were really 7 major themes that seemed to characterize the content of those fantasies. These were multi-partner sex, which was one of the most common, so having multiple partners at the same time. That was followed by BDSM, so power, control, and rough sex, taking a lot of different forms, ranging from, say, bondage and spankings to more intense activities. Another category was what I call novelty, adventure, and variety. So that was all about just doing new and different and exciting things for you and your sex life. Following that, there were fantasies about taboo activities. So just doing something that's culturally or socially forbidden, something you're not allowed to do. There were also fantasies about emotional connection and emotional fulfillment. So that could be feeling desired or validated or wanted or just feeling close to a partner. Then there were fantasies about homoeroticism and gender bending. So fantasies about sort of pushing the boundaries of your sexual orientation or gender identity. And then lastly, there were fantasies about non-monogamy. So basically being in some type of sexually open relationship, whether it's polyamorous or just having some other kind of open relationship.
Now, I am imagining how many of these overlap too, right? Like in somebody's favorite fantasies, they may hit all 7 of those, or at least a few, right? Like they're distinct themes, but not necessarily distinct fantasies, I'd imagine.
Exactly. So these are not mutually exclusive categories. I would describe them more as sort of the building blocks of our fantasies, and we can combine them in any number of unique ways.
Right. Now, did you find that most people have one main theme or collection of blocks that is, their eroticism? Or did people have a lot of variety in the kinds of things that they would fantasize about?
There was a lot of variety, and I actually did a follow-up study that I'm digging into the data on that now, and it's a separate sample of about 2,000 people where I kind of looked more at the combination of those themes, and I find that there's a lot of individual variability. These 7 themes account for about 96% of people's fantasies.
Wow.
So it's telling us that, these really do seem to be the key elements of our fantasies, but there's so much variability in terms of how people combine them that I wouldn't say there's sort of like one most common pattern.
Right. Okay. And then did you also talk to people about their comfort with their own fantasies? Because I know that in my own practice, right, a lot of people are very uncomfortable with the things that turn them on. And I don't know the statistics about I know it's common, but I don't know if that's most people or less than the majority.
Yeah, that's something where, again, there's a lot of variability. So I asked people about the emotions that their fantasy brings up for them. So when you're thinking about your favorite fantasy, to what extent do you feel positive emotions like pleasure, excitement, happiness, and so forth, versus to what extent do you feel negative emotions like shame, guilt, embarrassment, and anxiety? I find that, for most people, their fantasies do bring up positive feelings, but there was a lot of that shame and guilt and embarrassment that came up as well. And it was actually more common for my male participants than it was for female participants. So men actually felt more shame about their fantasies than women did, which I was a little surprised by, because, we live in a society where women tend to be judged more harshly than men for just being desirous of sex. But men were the ones who reported feeling more shame. And I think part of that might stem from the fact that men had more taboo fantasies overall than women. So maybe it's due to qualitative differences in the types of fantasies people have.
Okay. Well, so that leads into my next question that I'm thinking about is what did you learn about the differences between men and women? And of course, these are generalizations. I know we're dealing with individuals here, but in general, what came out to be different between men and women, between straight people and gay, queer, folk? Like where were the lines in that?
So it's a great question. And I think you're right to preface it by saying, we're talking about average differences here. There's a lot of variability and, some men and women are very similar. Some are very different, and that can go in all sorts of directions. But some of the key things I found were that men and women actually had a lot in common when it came to their sexual fantasies. So most of the things that men reported fantasizing about, women reported fantasizing about as well, and vice versa. But the areas where you saw differences were that men had more multi-partner fantasies than women did. So men were more likely to fantasize about, say, threesomes and group sex. And women had more fantasies about emotional connection with a partner. But women also had more fantasies about BDSM. And that was really sort of going the whole spectrum of BDSM activities. Women fantasized about more BDSM activities than men, largely across the board.
What's your theory about why that would be? I find that a little bit surprising.
Well, I mean, it ties in with why 50 Shades of Grey was such a big.
Certainly, she hit a vein, right? Like,
right, and why it seemed to appeal so much more to women than it did to men. Women are reporting a lot of these fantasies about BDSM, and I wonder to what extent it may be due to the fact that a lot of women are seeking escape and distraction when it comes to sex. And that's what BDSM activities do, is they sort of take you out of your head and sort of allow you to get lost and enjoy the moment. So that could be part of what it is. It could also be due to differences in the way that men and women see themselves in their fantasies, and women more likely to see themselves as the object of desire. And so when it comes to something like bondage or, other BDSM activities, maybe that's tied in with that desire to be the object of desire in the fantasy.
Oh, that's interesting. So that was another difference, that women tended to be the object more than what's the opposite of that? The doer in this?
Yes. So women saw themselves as the object more often, and men as acting on the object of their desire.
Okay.
Another interesting gender difference I saw was that men were more likely than women to have a specific other person in mind in their fantasies.
Oh.
Whereas women were more likely to focus on the setting in which their fantasy took place.
Interesting. Wow. I just find all this stuff so fascinating.
Right.
And then were there differences too between sort of gay and straight people, or not so much?
There were some. It was interesting because previous research had led me to believe that there really weren't going to be any differences based on sexual orientation other than just, say, the gender of your partner.
Right.
But what I found was that for people who identified as anything other than heterosexual, they had sort of more adventuresome fantasies across the board. So they had more taboo fantasies, more multi-partner fantasies. So they were a bit more adventuresome in their fantasies. And that might be because when you're a sexual minority, you've already violated one sexual taboo. And so maybe it becomes less costly to violate other taboos.
Huh. Interesting. So, maybe I should have asked you this first, but what made you take this research on? What was the impetus of deciding to spend all these years doing this?
So I had a lot of questions about sexual fantasies that I had just never seen answered in the research. And I came up with a lot of these questions through the process of writing a textbook on human sexuality. I did that a few years ago and published that in 2014. And I had to exhaustively review all the literature. And I just found I had all these questions that just no one was looking at. And so that was part of what inspired me to do the work. The other part is just that fantasies have always been really interesting to me. Ever since I started teaching college-level human sexuality courses, I would collect fantasies from my students anonymously. We'd sort of look for themes. And I just became really fascinated by the subject through that process.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm so glad you did it, because I think I've got that same fascination. Like I said, it's one of my favorite things to talk to clients about. Once they're solid enough in their relationship to move forward. So did you learn things about what our fantasies say about us, or how it relates to our own sexual history?
Yeah, there's a lot there. Okay. So our fantasies, for one thing, seem to be connected to our personalities, and where you fall on what are known as the big 5 personality factors in particular seem to say a lot about your fantasies. So, for example, if you're someone who is very high in the trait of extroversion, or you're very outgoing and sociable, you tend to be more outgoing and sociable in your sexual fantasies. So, for example, you have more multi-partner fantasies, more non-monogamy fantasies. By contrast, if you're someone who's very high in the trait of what's known as agreeableness, where you have a lot of care and concern for the well-being of others, you place a lot more emphasis on your partner's pleasure in your sexual fantasies. So all of these, different personality traits we have seem to be reflected in the content of our fantasies.
Okay, so that goes against something I have thought that I read with, Bader's book with arousal. I'm sure you've, read that, where sometimes people's eroticism or their sexual fantasies is so different than who they are in real life. Like if they're super powerful or running everything in real life, their fantasy may be to be dominated.
Right. And I think that ties in with another personality factor, which is something called conscientiousness, which is how detail oriented you are. And what I find is that people who are very high in conscientiousness, these people who are very detail oriented in reality, they tend to be very detail oriented in their fantasies, and they see more realistic versions of themselves in their fantasies. So if you're someone who's high in conscientiousness, your fantasies are probably going to be a more accurate reflection of who you are. But if you're lower in conscientiousness, maybe less so.
Interesting. Okay.
I also see that there are some people who just change themselves a lot more in their fantasies. People who just have very overactive imaginations, for example. Also people who are lower in self-esteem or who have a more insecure attachment style. They change themselves in their fantasies a lot more too. So there's certainly a lot of variability. Some people see themselves accurately. Some people are changing themselves. But I think that actually says a lot, just whether we make those changes about how we feel about ourselves and who we are.
Yeah. So when you're saying people change themselves in their fantasies, I would imagine that's for the better. I mean, right? If they've got insecure attachment, or if they feel insecure or inadequate or something, I'd imagine the direction they're going in their fantasy is that they're this powerful, confident person.
Right. And so it could be a personality change where they're becoming more confident. So for example, introverted people fantasize more about changing their personality in a way where they become more socially confident. For example, people who are very anxious or insecure fantasize about a more confident version of themselves as well. If your insecurities stem from your body or your appearance, then maybe you fantasize about changing the way you look in your fantasies.
Okay.
So it can go a lot of different ways.
Right. So what do you think it's important for people to sort of take apart their fantasies, understand what they're doing or why, or is this just interesting to those of us who deal with it professionally? What do you think's the role for individuals to sort of, examine their eroticism?
So I think it's important to note that our fantasies sometimes mean something. Sometimes they tell an interesting story about us. Other times they don't. So that classic Freudian saying about sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, that definitely applies in the case of sexual fantasies. Some people, for example, will have very imaginative fantasy content just because they're a very imaginative person. And so the fact that they have these sort of wild fantasies that might strike other people as bizarre doesn't really mean anything other than that they just like to think.
Right.
So we have to be careful in terms of, not going too far and overanalyzing fantasy content.
Right.
But I think it can be useful to sit there and look at, well, what is it that I'm fantasizing about? And what might that say about me? What might it say about certain sexual needs or desires I have that aren't being met? And what can I do to try and better meet those needs in my current sex life? Okay.
And so, for people who are having gender bender fantasies, if you're straight and you're fantasizing about same sex activity, or if you're a gay or lesbian person, you're fantasizing about heterosexual sex. Is that something that has significance towards for somebody's sexual orientation, or not? What do you think?
So I think sometimes it reflects the fact that a lot of people just have sexual fluidity, right? And so our fantasies are one way that we sort of experiment or explore the boundaries of our sexual orientation. So it could potentially signify that you're higher in sexual fluidity than someone else. Other times, though, it might just be that overactive imagination.
Right. Or maybe what's, maybe thought of as taboo a little bit.
Right. Yeah.
So you wouldn't do in real life or something like that.
Absolutely. And the taboo has a big appeal to a lot of people. When we're told not to do something, it makes us want to do it even more. And we see that plays out in our fantasies a lot.
Right. Hey, it's Jess. I'm just taking a little bit of a break in the middle of the show because I want to tell you more about my first round of teaching webinars that I'm doing all about navigating desire discrepancy. So this is almost universal in the clients that I work with. They're struggling with the fact that one of them wants more sex than the other. And of course, the reality is that is always true, and you don't always have to struggle with it, but it's really, really common. So I'm hosting a webinar. It is totally free to go over the 4 mistakes people make that get them stuck in these dynamics that are so problematic. I would love to have you join me. All you have to do is go to bettersexpodcast.com/webinar. You can get signed up. Again, totally free. Got a couple different choices of times. I hope you'll join me for that. So, okay, one more question along these lines. What about sexual trauma? How how often is that related to what somebody might be fantasizing about? Because we've got the concept of sort of, mastering something that we've experienced that's negative before, or something becoming eroticized potentially. Like, what did your research show?
So I did see that there were connections between previous experiences with sexual victimization and the content of people's fantasies. The associations were small, meaning that, just because you've experienced victimization doesn't guarantee that you're going to have a certain type of fantasy.
Yeah.
But what I saw was that there were a number of associations there. Some of them seemed a little inconsistent. So, for example, people who had been sexually victimized had more fantasies about emotional connection with a partner. So, feeling desired, validated, wanted. But at the same time, they also had more fantasies about emotionless sex, where they're just completely stripping all of the emotion away. And I think that what that reflects is the fact that different people cope with trauma in different ways.
Right.
Some people might be seeking to affirm the self, and so they're imagining that connection with another person, whereas others might try to just totally distance themselves and take all of the emotion out of sex because that's a more adaptive coping mechanism for them.
Right. So I guess our fantasies can be coping mechanisms for whatever we're dealing with, but they may not be. It might just be a cigar, right?
Right.
Because people without that trauma may have those same fantasies, so it's a little hard to see what's causing what.
Exactly. And I think that, when it comes to any given fantasy, there are a lot of potential roots to having that fantasy.
Right.
And again, that's where we need to be careful and kind of overanalyzing things. It can be easy for us to, say, point to a specific previous sexual experience or point to a specific personality trait and say, that must be the reason I have this fantasy. That may be true, but it might not be, because there's so many different factors that contribute to our fantasies.
Yeah. All right. So that leads into the part of the discussion about putting this into sort of practice. Like, what relevance does this have for people and couples in real life? And I mean, certainly when I talk to clients about this, I sort of differentiate between the things that are really fun to think about versus what do we actually want to do? Because those aren't necessarily the same thing.
Very true. Yes. So there's a difference between a fantasy and a desire.
Okay.
Right? When it comes to people's favorite fantasy of all time, I find that by and large, that does tend to be a desire. It's something that about 80% of my participants said they want to act on in the future.
Okay.
So for most people, that sort of go-to fantasy, the one they think about most often, is something that they would like to turn into a reality. However, there are probably dozens, maybe hundreds, maybe even thousands of things that you fantasized about before. Not all of those are desires. And in fact, if it's just sort of a one-off fantasy that you have, you probably don't necessarily want to act on it.
Right.
But this was one of the things that I was most interested to study, is sort of what is that connection between fantasy and reality. So how do people's experiences go if they decide to act on a fantasy or share it with a partner? And what I found was that for the most part, people were reporting positive experiences, that sharing their fantasies with their partners brought them closer together and improved their relationship. And when people acted on fantasies, they tended to report similarly positive experiences where it was as good as they expected or better. And that it improved their relationship. That wasn't true across the board, but
right.
In general, on average, it was a positive experience.
Well, that's good to hear. So that's got to be encouraging for, people listening, thinking, oh, wait, it's not such a big deal, because I know that people, it feels so personal, and a lot of people have never shared their fantasies with anyone else. So the idea of letting your partner in on that eroticism is intimidating for people.
Right. And I found that about half of my participants had shared their favorite fantasy with the partner before, the other half hadn't.
Yeah.
So it was pretty mixed there. But those who were sharing, basically, they seemed to like it. They seemed to say this was a good experience on the whole. Those who hadn't shared their fantasies felt more shame and guilt and embarrassment. And it seems that that's a big stumbling block for them, as they're worried about being judged. They're worried about their partner's reaction, and that's holding them back.
Well, yeah. And if you're starting out already ashamed of your own eroticism, your own fantasies, it's going to be that much harder, of course, to reveal that to a partner. And I know, like you said in your book, the people that responded to your survey were already willing to share their fantasies in a way that, maybe isn't representative of everybody.
Right. And I think that that's important to keep in mind, is that my data probably overestimate how many people have shared a fantasy
Right, right.
and how many people have acted on one, because these are people who are probably a little more comfortable to begin with their own sexuality and with talking about sex.
Right.
So the numbers are probably much lower for people who are more sexually conservative.
Yeah. But there is a lot of power in sharing that with a partner. I mean, to dip into eroticism and into the mental components that go into our fantasies, there's just so much fuel there for arousal, so that's part of why I talk to clients about it.
Right. And even if you decide not to act on it, that's totally fine. A lot of people find that just sharing their fantasies is this very erotic experience. It can sort of fan the flames of passion by sort of creating some excitement. It can be a form of dirty talk.
Right.
So there are lots of ways that you can use that to create sexual excitement.
Yeah. So do you have suggestions or tips for, how does somebody bring this topic up with a partner? What's the best way to share your fantasies, in your relationship, just to talk about it first?
So there are a few key things to keep in mind here.
Okay.
One is it goes back to something we were just talking about, which is you kind of have to feel good about yourself first before you can open yourself up to this conversation. And that's one of the things I try to do in the book, is to help normalize people's sexual fantasies, to make them realize they're not alone in fantasizing about this.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I see that contributes to the shame and guilt is that most people think their fantasies are rarer than they really are.
Yeah.
So,
I'm the only one in the world imagining this. Yeah.
yeah. So I ask people, for your favorite fantasy, what percentage of the population do you think also has this fantasy? And for the most part, they were underestimating that. So, and when they underestimated it, they felt more shame. So,
yeah.
You have to get good with you first. And I think, learning about what's normal when it comes to sex can be a really helpful thing. Once you sort of get past that, then when it comes to starting the conversation with your partner, it's sort of starting low and going slow, right? You don't want to lay everything out there all at once. So just sort of work up to it. Think of self-disclosure of fantasies as this gradual process where, you start by sharing some of your tamer fantasies. You build up trust and intimacy in the relationship. And, when you start realizing, hey, you share a fantasy and your partner doesn't judge you and they validate you and affirm you, that can, when that's reciprocal, when it goes both ways, that can lay the groundwork for sharing more adventuresome fantasies later on.
Yeah. Yeah. And what about, when your fantasy isn't so well received by your partner, even if they're not, shaming you, what about when two people, it doesn't line up?
And that's okay. And it's probably going to happen oftentimes that, each of you might have a fantasy that maybe the other person doesn't share or they're not quite as into. That's okay. The good news is that most people have multiple fantasies. And so you're going to be able to keep sharing and find some areas where there is common ground. So just because you aren't a match on one fantasy doesn't mean it's a deal breaker and that you're not going to match on anything else. It's, keep going, find the areas of common ground. And if you have a fantasy that, maybe your partner isn't totally comfortable with, maybe think about whether there are different ways of expressing the theme that's there in a way that makes your partner more comfortable. So for example, in the case of forced sex fantasies, right? These are very, very common, but they do make a lot of people uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It's not that people are fantasizing about, truly forcing sex on someone else. They're usually fantasizing about some token resistance and it's a consensual scenario, but
right.
But forced sex fantasies are based in BDSM desires. And so is there a different variant of BDSM that, could be appealing to your partner, right? So it's just sort of thinking about different ways of expressing the desire to get everybody on board.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know if I didn't see this in the book exactly, but I also sometimes suggest people talk as if some of this is happening, even if they're not doing it. So that's another way to harness that fantasy is, talk as if there were other people about to come in the room or as if, there was force or something like that without necessarily having to, enact this.
Sure. And I think that sort of gets into the role playing a bit where it's sort of, they're acting out the fantasy in a way without going, the full step forward to truly doing it. So I think what you're saying is a good way to sort of, test the waters and kind of see, is this appealing and how might we want to go from here?
Right, right. And to me, it sort of bridges between fantasy and desire,
Yes.
right? Like it's still in the fantasy realm. I don't want to actually do it, but it's fun enough to think about that I'd like to bring that storyline into the encounter.
Yes, absolutely.
Anything else people should be thinking about in terms of, implementing some, acting out some of these fantasies?
Yeah. When it comes to acting them out, it's important to consider both the potential rewards and the potential risks, right? So
Okay.
there's a lot of good things that could potentially happen if you shared and acted out a fantasy. It could bring you and your partner closer. It could create a very high level of sexual excitement. So you could have these positive outcomes, but at the same time, there are also risks. Maybe the fantasy doesn't turn out quite the way you expected. And maybe you find that, for example, if it's a threesome fantasy and you act that out with your partner, maybe you find that you get really jealous in that situation, or maybe your partner does, right? So there are those negative things that can happen as well. And it's important to recognize that we aren't very good at predicting how we're going to feel in other situations until those situations actually happen.
Right.
So go into this recognizing that, hey, everything might not go according to plan, and it might not turn out exactly the way that you did in your fantasy. So it's important to think ahead, plan ahead, and just be prepared for the unexpected.
It also makes me think it must be important to sort of debrief at the end. And especially if something didn't go so well, you try a threesome and there was jealousy or it was awkward or whatever, that there'd be a coming together around that and sort of, I don't know, it's like a postmortem or something. What happened? Is it something we want to try again and tweak it? Or is this something now we're not interested in? But, like a coming together for the couple to make sure that they repair anything.
Absolutely. And I think the way to look at this is it's an ongoing conversation and dialogue. And if you're going to act on your fantasies, you're going to have a lot of conversation beforehand and a lot of conversation afterwards.
Yeah.
And if things didn't go exactly the way you wanted them to, that doesn't mean that you have to totally stop acting on your fantasies.
Right.
It just means revisit your rules and come up with a different plan for next time. Try something different. Maybe act on a different fantasy. And this is where I think that sort of gradual process that I was talking about earlier comes into play, where if you're going to act on some fantasies, start with the tamer and easier ones. Right? Don't jump into threesomes and orgies. That's there's a lot that can potentially go wrong.
Right. That's sort of the deep end of the pool is how I describe that.
Yep.
Right?
Yep. Start by just dipping the toes in the water and doing the fantasies that are very, say, couple centric. So you and your partner might watch pornography together, visit a sex shop together, experiment with sex toys. That's a good way to sort of get into it, build up that trust and intimacy. And then if you wanted to, if it's mutually desired, progress to more adventuresome activities later.
Yeah, that reminds me of another suggestion I give to people, which is to share erotic material together to really communicate these fantasies. Because, whether it's a pornography or a video or an erotic story, like I feel like that helps really set the scene for the other person's mind so they can really understand what it is that turns you on. Seems to me an important part of the communication going in.
Absolutely. And it's important to note that, two people in a relationship could have the same fantasy and, maybe they say, oh yeah, we're both into threesomes. Great. But maybe they're imagining those threesomes in completely different ways.
Right.
So if both of them want to be the center of attention in that scenario, that could create a conflict.
Yeah. And what gender is the third person, right?
Exactly. And I see that in heterosexual couples, threesome fantasies tend to play out a bit differently in terms of the desired gender composition, who's going to be the center of attention. So that's why I find that the threesome fantasies and group sex fantasies actually tend to turn out the least well of all fantasies that people act on, precisely because there's a lot of these discrepant ideals as to how that activity should go.
Right. That's why I find, finding some sort of film or story that lays some of that out so you can really get to the nuance of what it is each person wants.
Right. And then, there's also the other factor when it comes to something like group sex. How do you even find another person or person?
Right. And how do they play along by the rules you and your partner have made, right? Like you're dealing with so many different people at that point. All of them have different ideas maybe about how this is supposed to go.
Yep. And is that person equally into the other two partners?
Right.
There's a lot of variables there.
There are. Did your research touch at all on whether people struggle, like, how much of sex is going to be about fantasies? And how much is this just like a little bit of saffron in the dish,
Mm-hmm. So when you start sharing your fantasies, it doesn't mean that you have to do this, every time you have sex. And it doesn't mean you have to act on any and all fantasies that you might have. But what we see in the data, not just my research, but other research as well, is that people who are sharing and acting on their fantasies are reporting more satisfying sexual relationships. They report keeping passion alive for longer in their relationship. So it can be a very useful tool for spicing up the relationship and keeping things sexy. But I would think of it as just one of many tools, one of many ways of adding novelty to your sex life, because novelty really seems to be one of the keys. So other things people do that tend to increase passion are, giving each other massages and, having intimate connection with their partner and deep conversation. So it's not just about the fantasy. It's sort of, the fantasy is part of a broader set of ways of we're adding novelty to the relationship.
Right. Great. So where can people, say a little bit more about the book and where people can get in touch with you or learn more about you?
Sure. So I run a website. It's called Sex and Psychology. It's accessible at sexandpsychology.com. And I write about the latest sex research there several times a week. You can follow the blog, or you can follow me on Twitter or Facebook or any of your favorite social media accounts at Justin Lehmiller.
Great. I'll put all those links too in the show notes so people can get to it easily.
Great.
Well, thank you so much for being here. This was a fascinating conversation, and I hope it does wonders for people that are listening.
I hope so too. Thanks for having me, Jessa.
Sure.
You've been listening to Better Sex. Please visit our website, bettersexpodcast.com, for show notes and additional episodes.
And that's a wrap for today. I really hope you enjoyed the episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, if some of this material resonates with you and you would like to make a difference and make sure that this keeps coming out in the world once a week, ongoing, there are a couple things you could do to show your appreciation. The first would be to go to iTunes and rate and review the show. That really helps us be found by new listeners when you review the show on iTunes. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/iTunes. The other thing I want to invite you to consider is becoming a Patreon. For a small monthly pledge, you get some benefits. So for $2 a month, you get advance access to every single episode. For $5 a month, you get a chapter of my upcoming new book. And for $10 a month, I host quarterly get-to-know-you and question-and-answer chats over the web, and you get invited to that. I would love to have your membership in that, become part of the Better Sex family. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/Patreon, which is Patreon. Again, thanks for listening. I'm glad you're here. Feel free to comment, ask questions, get in touch. I'd love to hear from listeners. Thanks.